The fact Ukraine had an election at all in the middle of a conflict was an accomplishment. Whether it will help the government end the crisis is another question. The conflict is full of mixed signals. A ceasefire that appears real only in name. Russian troops have pulled back, but Russian support of the rebels hasn't. The presidents of Russia and Ukraine meet. President Putin meets with EU leaders, and talks on a gas deal before the winter offer hope of a lessening of tensions. Will the election's outcome change anything? What should the EU and the rest of the West be doing now? Ease sanctions against Russia or wait and see? Hello, I'm Chris Burns, and welcome to The Network, hard talk with a matrix of newsmakers. Wired into this edition from Kiev, Dmytro Kuleba, Ukrainian ambassador at large. From Brussels, Hans van Balen, Dutch Liberal member of the European Parliament, who's part of the Parliament's observation delegation to Ukraine. He observed the elections that occurred in Ukraine. And from Brussels, Daniel Gross, director of the Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS. A question to all three of you, starting with the ambassador, Dmytro. These election results, in which pro-European parties came out on top, do they justify more government pressure on the rebels, or perhaps an olive branch?
Yeah, I think the outcome of elections is a clear signal to everyone in Ukraine and outside Ukraine that our country wants to be European and democratic and to live in peace.
But does that mean you want to, you will get tougher with the rebels, or will you seek some sort of negotiated solution? Are you going to get softer with them?
No, our policy with regard to rebels will be consistent. I do not expect any dramatic changes to take place with that regard.
Okay, let's go to Hans. What do you think? Will this justify more pressure on the rebels?
Well, it means that President Poroshenko has a strong support, as has Yatsenuk, the prime minister, and they want to negotiate. So the Ukrainians accepted that and supported that. And an olive branch means, well, elections also in the eastern part of Ukraine could be held, but then under international supervision.
Daniel, an olive branch or no?
Olive branch might be forthcoming, but I doubt it will have much effect, because the rebels in the east know very well what they want, their own independent state-led, and that's not something any Ukrainian government could concede.
Okay, now we're looking for a peaceful solution. Ambassador, how much autonomy do you think, how much more autonomy should eastern Ukraine, those areas, get to end this crisis?
Well, you are right. This crisis is devastating Ukraine. We are ready to compromises, but there are three issues which are not subject to negotiations. And this is territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the European choice of Ukraine. On all other issues, we can speak with rebels, we can speak with Russia, we can speak with everyone who can help us to put an end to this crisis in the east of Ukraine.
Okay, Daniel, I think this sounds to me like they're not going to move on these very key issues that the separatists want movement on. What do you think?
Exactly. I think there's very little to negotiate since these people won what they have by the force of arms. They are not likely to cede anything via the election box, and therefore some negotiation might be going on the surface, but reality is that the arms will speak and have spoken already, and that's really what determines the outcome.
So Hans, do you think this is going to be settled on the battlefield after all?
Not necessary, because there are, I think, tough sanctions on Putin. He has the key in his hands. He is the man who is the aggressor. He could stop aggression, and he could say, let the Ukrainians deal with it themselves. So pressure on Putin is the only way out.
Okay, now let's shift a bit in another direction. What about pressure on the government now after these elections? The government now has to follow through on these commitments through the association agreement with the EU to reform the economy, to fight corruption, to improve conditions there, governance. Ambassador, how much are you concerned that the EU might pull back on some of its commitments if you don't follow through?
Absolutely not. We are confident in our European friends and partners. But I think the most important thing is that the biggest pressure will be put on the government from the Ukrainian people It is the people of Ukraine who will push the government to introduce reforms.
Okay.
Pro-European reforms.
Okay, Daniel, do you think this Maidan is just another orange revolution that's going to fail? How much confidence do you have that this new government is going to follow through?
No, there is real pressure from below. That is quite clear that the Ukrainian people want reforms, that they want a European orientation of their policies. Unfortunately, we have seen in many countries in Southeastern Europe that that's what people want, but that's not always what they get. Sometimes corruption continues, bad administrative practices continue, and that's really the challenge for the government to get its act together.
Hans, you were on the ground there. You've been there a number of times, I understand. What is your sense there? Do you really think this government's going to be able to follow through on what they need to do, on their commitments?
I'm sure, and also because the people demand this. Ukraine should follow the Polish examples. Real reform, fight against corruption, a better government, and this can be done. The Poles have showed the way, so follow that example, and then Ukraine will prosper. If that is not done, I see only a very negative future.
Well, yes, because there's a lot of fatigue among Europeans when it comes to help. Ambassador, what do you think that the EU should be doing now to support your government from an economic and from a military standpoint?
Well, I think the first important thing is that the European Union and Ukraine should stand shoulder to shoulder as one side in the conflict with regard to Russia. So no easing sanctions at this point, no easing political pressure on the Russian Federation is possible. On the other hand, what we expect from the European Union is helping us in introducing reforms which are essential for Ukraine's survival and development.
Okay, but what does that mean, sir? What does that mean, Ambassador, as far as what the EU should be doing? Should they be giving you more money, cutting you more slack, helping you with the gas, for instance?
It means financial support, technical support, and also actually know-how, sharing know-how, best practices, experiences. We are open for this kind of cooperation.
Okay, Hans, you've just gone through an election in spring. How much do you think that the Europeans can stomach more support for Ukraine when things are tough back at home?
Well, they can, because if we let down Ukraine, Putin, the man of aggression and not of international law, will win. And this is bad news also for other countries in Europe. So I think that the population will back also the political leadership to support Ukraine on the basis of true and real reform in Ukraine itself.
Okay, last question very, very quickly. Daniel, do you think that the sanctions should remain as they are against Russia, or should they be perhaps loosened now that there was an election, the government has a mandate now?
No, they should certainly not be loosened because there was a fair election in Ukraine. They might be loosened if Russia makes concessions on the rebel-held areas.
Okay. To you, Dimitro, do you think that the sanctions should remain as they are, or toughened or loosened because of the election results? You have a mandate now.
Well, sanctions depend on the behavior of Russia. If we see a clear commitment of Russia to de-escalate, to bring peace to Ukraine, then we can speak about changing the sanction policy. But so far, it hasn't been the case.
Okay. And Hans, very, very quickly also, Total's CEO Christophe Malgerie, who died in a recent plane crash, was among Western industrialists, businessmen who said, look, we've got to engage with the Russians. We should have constructive engagement, not the opposite. Do you see some logic in that, or do you think that we should hold firm on the sanctions?
There is no logic in talking with aggressors. Putin should change his policy, and that is get out of Ukraine, let the Ukrainians deal with their internal situation, and that is backed by sanctions. No loosening of sanctions now, absolutely not.
Hans, thank you very much. That's all the time we've got for now. I'd like to thank our guests, Dimitro Kuleba, Hans van Balen, and Daniel Gross. I'm Chris Burns, and until next time, thanks for connecting with the network.